Okay, welcome. We are continuing our discussion of Descartes. This time around, we're going to be looking at the fourth of Descartes' six meditations in Meditations on First Philosophy. So, we're going to be looking at today what I'm going to call the problem of error. And this is going to open up some conversations about free will and what we're talking about when we talk about having free will or freedom of action. So, here's a problem that Descartes is not explicitly talking about in Meditation 4, and that's an old problem that comes out of theology called the problem of evil. Right? The problem of evil tells us that God is supposed to be the most perfect being. This is something that Descartes has argued to us in Meditations 3 and 5. The problem of evil asks, how is the existence of pointless suffering compatible with an all-powerful and loving God? So you might think that there are examples of pointless suffering happening in your life or the life of other people or in the lives of animals, perhaps. And you might say, look, if God is as he's understood within traditional theology, sometimes we call this the triple O God, a God that is omnipotent, that is all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and omnibenevolent, that is completely loving or completely good, right? We might think that a completely powerful and loving God, with all the knowledge that God could ever need, wouldn't let a person in the prime of their life get cancer, for instance. So this has been an old, long-standing theological and philosophical head-scratcher, the problem of evil, right? Some people think that this question and this challenge should lead us to not believe in God, whereas others think that maybe they can make the existence of God compatible with pointless suffering. The idea of maybe somebody getting cancer in the prime of their life. So when you try to give an answer to the problem of evil, this is sometimes referred to as a theodicy, right? A theodicy is basically like an explanation of how an all-good and all-powerful God could allow suffering, right? Two classic answers. One says, everything is going according to God's bigger plan. You might not see the point of terrible things happening here and now and in this moment when all you see is the suffering, but sometimes it's said maybe these things could be paid back. Maybe people learn from the hard parts of their lives, or maybe it's all part of a bigger plan that God has. If you just zoom in and look at a particular problem, you might say, God is just too mysterious for us to understand why a bad thing happens. Here's a second line of thought. Bad things happen because God gave us free will. So if we think about something like original sin, why is it that Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, picked the apple from the tree of knowledge and ate it? Well, the thought would be, they had free will. They used their free will. God didn't make them pick the apple from the tree of knowledge, and that is, where original sin comes from, right? So the thought is, it's not God's fault that there's suffering in the universe. Rather, it's suffering that's derived not from God, but from the free actions of free agents. So, Descartes isn't really talking about the problem of evil here, but the reason why I'm bringing it up is that it's a long-standing philosophical problem that shares deep analogies with what we find in Meditation 4. So here's the parallel problem, right? We were created by a non-deceiving God. There are places in the Meditations where Descartes tells us that God could not be deceiving us in our perceptions of the world, in the way that God made us. because to deceive, according to Descartes, is a sign of weakness or imperfection. So, just like God is all-powerful and all-good, we would say that an all-powerful and all-good God wouldn't give us faculties of perception and reasoning that would mislead us, right? But then we encounter a problem, and it says, look, people are prone to making errors in their judgment. We find this right at the beginning of the Meditations, right? Descartes says, I've looked back and thought about all the things I've believed in my life, and I used to think one thing, and now I know that it couldn't possibly be true. So I've believed all sorts of things. Not all of these things that I've believed can be right. So there we've got a problem, right? We've got a non-deceiving God who made us, but then we step back on the situation and realize, but wait a second, we make mistakes all the time. Here's how Descartes puts it on page 112. There is in me a certain faculty of judgment which, like everything else that is in me, I undoubtedly received from God. And since he does not wish to deceive me, he assuredly has not given me the sort of faculty with which I could make a mistake when I use it properly. That's an important caveat. He goes on to say, it seems to follow from this that I am never capable of making a mistake, but that seems to fly in the face of just common experience that, well, I've been wrong about a lot of things in my life. Descartes' meditator is saying that, and if we think about ourselves, we can think about all the things that we've believed wrongly throughout our lives. All right, so just like there's a problem of evil when it comes to unnecessary suffering, this is what I'm going to call the problem of error, right? We've got this God who doesn't want to deceive you and gives us the faculties which don't make mistakes, but we make mistakes. So does that mean that we weren't the product of God after all? Well, Descartes is going to do sort of a theodicy, but not about unnecessary suffering, but about errors. So he says, error occurs through the functioning of what he first calls the faculty of knowing and the faculty of choosing. Descartes says, why do I make errors? Well, he says, they proceed not from a single thing that God put in us, but actually two things that God gave us working together simultaneously. He goes on to say, namely from the faculty of knowing, which I possess, and from the faculty of choosing, that is, or from my freedom to choose. In other words, now he's giving us two new names for this faculty of knowing and the faculty of choosing, the intellect and the will. Right? So God gave you not just one capability, but two capabilities with your mind. One is your faculty of choosing, and one is your faculty of knowing. So the idea is you've got a perfectly good will and you've got a perfectly good intellect that is not made with any mistakes in it. But when you mix your faculty of knowing with your faculty of willing, that's where mistakes can come from, when they work together. Now, one thing that we might notice is we are finite beings, right? So the idea is your intellect is a limited thing. You don't know everything, right? You don't have every idea that has ever been in the universe within the contents of your brain, in your thinking. Think about this for a second. Think about a notebook. Notebooks are good for lots of stuff, right? You can write down your appointments or your thoughts and your feelings, or maybe important things you need to remember from your classes as you're listening to lectures. Now, you might think that's a really good tool for those kinds of jobs, right? Now, would it be right for somebody to complain, yes, it's a very good notebook for those kinds of jobs, but it's an imperfect notebook, or it's a bad notebook, because I cannot, no matter how tiny I write, fit all of human knowledge all the knowledge of the universe into this little notebook. A similar thing, if you think about a thing like your phone, well, your phone cannot contain, all of human knowledge in it because it only has, 32 gigabytes of storage, right? You can't fit all of human knowledge into 32 gigabytes of storage. And we might say, is that a problem with the phone itself? Well, no, it's perfectly good for fitting enough data and enough information onto it for a phone. When God gave us our minds and our intellects, our intellects have power to know certain things, remember certain things, entertain various ideas. But your intellectual limitations for Descartes aren't bugs in what God actually gave you. It's not flaws, it's just privations, right? God gave you some mind, but not all the mind, right? Like a phone with 32 gigs of storage has less storage than a 64 or a 128 gig iPhone, but it doesn't mean it's an inherently bad phone, right? So lacking a bit more storage on your phone, that's just a privation. That's the first point, right? So it's actually not a complaint against God that our intellects aren't as big as could possibly be, right? Here's the second point. Descartes says God not only gave you a limited intellect, but he also gave you an infinite will. He says God could not give you less of a will, right? So what is Descartes going to say here? He's actually going to say, well, here's what happens when you make an intellectual mistake, when you form errors of judgment. He says, well, it's because your will makes a decision to believe something, right? Your will is acting in a way where it affirms something instead of staying indifferent, right? Now, when you affirm something instead of staying indifferent, that's sort of an act of the will for Descartes. He says, we're going to make mistakes sometimes. We're at least going to be acting irresponsibly if you make affirmations when you, with your will, decide, I am going to stand behind this belief, believe it and assert it, and not withhold judgment. When you do that before you fully understand something, that's how it's possible for you to make an error. So he says, when I do not perceive that something is true with sufficient clarity and distinctness, if in fact I abstain from rendering judgment, I am acting correctly and am not deceived. But if at that time I affirm or deny, then I am not using my freedom to choose properly, right? And it's this incorrect use of the freedom of the will that finds the privation which constitutes the nature of my error. So the way that Descartes is thinking about it, yeah, people do make errors. He has an explanation of where these errors come from. And the explanation of where these errors come from is that you have a limited intellect and you let your will, which has control over whether you affirm or deny something, whether you, if you affirm or deny something before you fully understand, before you've had a distinction with sufficient clarity and distinctness, that's when you start running the risk of error. So even though God gave you a perfectly good intellect and a perfectly good will, you can still make mistakes by using your will irresponsibly. So in a certain way, we can think about this as a free will defense against the problem of error, right? So why do we make mistakes? Well, God, by giving you free will, made it possible for you to make mistakes, just so long as you're in a situation where you are using your will irresponsibly. Now, we need to zoom in for Descartes on what we're actually talking about when we talk about a will. One thing some people will ask in objection to this argument is, why couldn't God just give you less of a will that's not going to outrun your intellect? Well, here Descartes says, at a certain level, you have a will just as much as God has a will. That seems to be a pretty wild claim, especially given that God seems to be better at making decisions, you would assume, because God is acting with a much richer set of information than you do. Of course, God is omniscient. You are not, right? And Descartes admits so much, that God is better at making decisions than you are because he has more information. So in a certain sense, God has a more powerful will than we do, right? But he says when we zoom in, when we think formally, as he puts it, he says, at some level, you and God have a will just as much, right? He says the will consists solely in the fact that when something is proposed to us by our intellect, either to affirm or deny, to pursue or shun, we are moved in such a way that we sense that we are determined to it by no external force. So, for Descartes, what does it mean to have a will? Well, it's this ability to do or not do, to have alternate possibilities among your options, and to have a will that is not determined by external forces, right? So it might be that there could be certain things that influence you in your decisions, like maybe you act a little bit more rashly when you're drunk, or a little more slower if you haven't had your coffee yet, right? But he says even if that may be the case, even if you have a harder time, making your decision before you've had your coffee, he's going to say you're still not determined by that external force, which might be a lack of caffeine, right? He's going to say if you really have a will, you still have that power to do or not do something. And external forces, like the way that your body is, or forces outside of you, those external forces are not the last thing that's going to determine whether or not you do something. So for Descartes, having a will is to have this undetermined power to do or not do. And the idea is you have free will, just like God does, but it's just this simple ability, right? It's this power to do or not do and not being determined by outside forces. Well, in that sense, anything that counts as a will is a thing that has this power to do or not do. And in that way, we can think of having a will as either a yes or no question. For Descartes, it's like an on or off switch. There are things that don't have the power to do or not do. I don't know, like this coin that I'm holding here. When I let go of it, it just falls, right? And the idea is it's not making any decision. It's just going to do what it's going to do. But you're not like that. You have the ability to make decisions, just like God does. And in that sense, you have a will just like God does. It's an on or off kind of question, right? Now, your intellect could always be greater, but when it comes to the power of willing, you either have it or you don't. So you have an infinite will just like God does. That's how Descartes puts it. He does also seem to refer to the idea that, look, you can also experience the infinitude of your will. Maybe he's saying it's because people have lots of desires that can't be satisfied. Maybe he's also just pointing out the idea that, look, you can see it in yourself that your decisions are not fully determined by outside forces. All right, let me give you an example of how this theory of error might work. So here's an example from Daniel Kahneman. Let's see, I just had the book out. Daniel Kahneman has a really wonderful book called Thinking Fast and Slow. Here it is. This book, Thinking Fast and Slow, it's a very popular and interesting book about how the human mind works, and some of our cognitive biases that we have. Now, I think that one illustration from this book can be usefully employed to illustrate Descartes' theory of error. So here's the situation. Here's the puzzle that Kahneman has experimentally put to many people. It says this: a bat and ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? What's your answer? That's a question that Kahneman has asked very many people, and many people answer that the ball must cost 10 cents. But that's wrong, actually. If you think about it, if the ball costs 10 cents and the bat costs $1, that would add up to $1.10, yeah, but then the difference would be 90 cents, not $1. Do you see that? Now, we might even be able to realize that what you actually have to do with this case is a little bit of algebra. We've got the price of the ball and then the price of the bat, which is the price of the ball plus $1, and that's going to add up to $1.10. We could convert that to 2x plus 1 equals $1.10, so 2x equals 10 cents, if you're following me on the algebra still. So x, that's the price of the ball, is 5 cents, right? So in order to get the right answer, you realize that the bat costs $1.05 and the ball costs 5 cents. Now, maybe you saw through my trick question, maybe because I was warning you, or maybe just because you are a really smart person who uses Cartesian clear and distinct perceptions all the time. But if we want to put this in Descartes' terms, answering quickly and intuitively, if you just look at this problem and use your gut feeling, you are not using clear and distinct perceptions there. You're not really perceiving the necessary connections between the various ideas in this problem. So if you give that quick, intuitive gut answer of 10 cents, that's a case where your decision to answer is sort of outrunning your ability to sit down and work through this little simple bit of algebra here. So what we might say is that, like, look, slowing down and doing the algebra is keeping your will in check. It's making sure that we're going to slow down, we're not going to make a judgment until we've really thought things through. So that's like letting the intellect lead and letting the will come along only once you're sure, and that's when you can, affirm the correct answer that the ball costs 5 cents. Right? So it's this kind of intellectual control that Descartes is advocating for as a way of avoiding error. And he's going to say that every time you do make an error, it's because you haven't been as careful and intellectually responsible as you might have been. Now, last thing I want to do for this brief video is contextualize Descartes' view within various views about free will. Now, here's one view that we need to consider. If you want to figure out what somebody's view about free will is, one thing that you're going to have to ask them is, are you a determinist? Right? If you're a determinist, you believe that every event is a necessary consequence of the present state of the universe and the laws of nature. We might think about exactly how the world is at this moment, and then we'll say, at the very next moment, what's the world going to be like then? And we might say, well, it's going to be what the world was like a moment ago, and then it's just going to be the laws of nature playing out. So the next moment is necessitated. It had to happen as a result of those laws of nature, right? So people who are determinists are people who think, look, everything that ever has happened because it had to. And we can basically say that also everything that will happen is a thing that couldn't be avoided because everything is just a result of the previous states of the universe and the laws of nature. We should just notice that this view is distinct from fatalism. So determinism says that everything that will happen is going to happen. Fatalism is the view that some things have to happen no matter what you try, right? So the idea of fatalism is the idea that maybe there's like something out there in the future that has to happen no matter what you attempt to do. The fatalist is the person who says, well, I shouldn't even try because my disfavored political candidate is going to win anyways, or global warming is just going to happen anyways. The mistake that most fatalists make, most philosophers tend to notice, is that your decisions and willing and choosing and trying are just yet another part of nature. And basically, your noticing things and trying certain things means that not everything that's possible in the future is definitely going to happen. Now, if you're thinking about fatalism, I guess the key example you could think of would be from the Greek tragedy by Sophocles, Oedipus the King. In this Greek tragedy, an oracle tells Oedipus, hey Oedipus, you're going to murder your father and marry your mother. And Oedipus is like, nuh-uh, I'm not going to. And then he goes and he murders a guy who happens to be his dad after all, and then he ends up marrying a woman who, unbeknownst to him, was his mom. So this is the view that, like, no matter what you try, the certain thing in the future is going to happen. It's a little different than the view that each event is the unfolding of various things. I think that the main thing that we should notice here is that for the determinist, your efforts, your experiences, and your attempting to do certain things is going to have an effect on the course of events. So the determinist is not going to say that there's no point in your trying. But that's one of the first questions we're going to have to ask somebody in order to figure out their view about free will. So we get clear on this idea that determinism, everything that has happened and will happen, happens necessarily. We also have the view called compatibilism. Now, if you are a compatibilist, sometimes compatibilists will get called soft determinists as well. So the compatibilist is going to say, if the universe is deterministic, so if everything that happens had to happen, here's what the compatibilist is going to say: it's still possible to have free will. So the compatibilist is going to say, look, everything that happens may well be the necessary result of the laws of nature, right? But even if everything does have to happen, we can still talk about free will or free actions. People still do things freely, even in a universe constrained by the laws of nature. Now, some people find this compatibilist viewpoint incoherent. If everything that ever happens had to happen, we might say that was already determined before you were ever born. So if everything that's going to happen is going to happen before you were even born, then can we really call anything you ever do a choice? So the incompatibilist is going to say, if the universe were deterministic, then free will and free actions would be impossible. The incompatibilist would seem to think that a deterministic universe would make us, like cogs in the machine. It would make every choice we make just an inevitable consequence of the laws of nature, just like the falling of this coin from one hand into the other onto my desk is, a necessary consequence of the laws of nature. Right? So the incompatibilist says, look, if the universe really were deterministic, then there would be no free will. Now, we get two views within the incompatibilist perspective. Some people deny that anybody has free will on the basis of believing that determinism is true and being an incompatibilist. right? So the incompatibilist, free will denier, these people are also called hard determinists sometimes, right? It's the tough, hard, sad conclusion that, look, all of our actions, if they're determined, well, the hard determinist is going to say, yeah, all our actions are determined, and determinism ruins free will. So there is no free will, right? But some other incompatibilists say, look, if the universe is deterministic, then there would be no free will. But guess what? We do have free will, right? So the libertarian is going to say some of our actions are not determined, so we do have free will. Now, let's look at Descartes' quote about what the universe looks like. He says, "The will consists solely in the fact that when something is proposed to us by our intellect to either affirm or deny, to pursue or shun, we are moved in such a way that we sense we are determined to it by no external force." Now, he does say we can be determined to do things by our intellect. But he's going to say that being determined by something due to your intellect, which is like an immaterial mind, notice that he's saying that, look, your mind is determined by no external force. And in this sense, he's going to say, you, by having a will, have this real power to affirm or deny. So it seems to me that Descartes is saying that determinism is false, right? The universe is actually indeterministic, that with your mind you can actually do or not do. You can actually shun or affirm, or pursue or shun, affirm or deny, right? So to fit Descartes' view in, I would say that Descartes says we do have a will. We do have this thing that we can even call freedom of the will. He uses that term in Meditation 4. But he also notices that your will is not controlled by external forces. And this is the way that we're determined by no external force, is a denial of determinism, right? So he denies determinism, and also says that having a will, having freedom, really, is the power to do or not do, right? So he's rejecting determinism, and he also says we do have a will. So this is a way that within this passage, we can characterize Descartes' view as a libertarian view of free will. Free will is one of the powers of your soul, and your soul is not part of material physical nature, right? It is a free and undetermined immaterial substance with its own powers of activity. So we're going to wrap things up there, but we can see that Descartes finds himself with what I've called the problem of error, and we solve the problem of error by bringing in this concept of free will, which could be categorized as a libertarian approach to free will in the end. So thanks as always for listening, and we'll check in soon. Take care.